Hey, how's it going everyone? It's Blake here from ChessPathways.com, and in today's openings video, we're going to be talking about the Alapin variation of the Sicilian defense. The Sicilian defense begins with pawn to e4 and pawn to c5, this position right here, and I'll go ahead and drop a link down in the description to my video on the Sicilian defense if you want more of a general overview of this opening, but you should know that it's very common for white to try to open up the position with knight f3, and pawn to d4. That's the main line of the Sicilian defense. The downside is that in exchange for opening up the position, white has to trade away one of their valuable center pawns for black's flank pawn here on c5. So to combat that, one of white's ideas might be to play c3 here to prepare d4 instead of playing knight f3, and this is the Alapin variation. The Alapin variation has become quite popular in recent years because it cuts down on the number of lines white has to know. You don't have to memorize nearly as many possible lines black can throw at you here as you do in the mainline open Sicilian with knight f3 and d4. And secondly, if black's not well prepared for this, it's pretty easy to get a very good position. I remember a game I played about 10 years ago now where black simply played knight c6. I got to play d4, takes, that's the whole point. You get to take back with the pawn and keep your center pawns. And in that game, black just played e6, knight c3, d6, and this is white's dream position, right? You got to open up the center, you have the full center, you didn't have to sacrifice one of your center pawns, you're going to get a lead in development, black's a bit cramped, and white's already clearly better. So this is the exact kind of position you're going for when you play the Alapin variation. Now, what's the downside? This move doesn't come without its costs, or everyone would play it, and it would be the main line. So the main downside of playing c3 is it takes away the best square from this knight. Knight f3 is a developing move, it develops a piece. c3 actually hinders white's development for the time being because it deprives this knight of its best square. And because of this, it's going to make sense to see how black often plays against the Alapin if they're well prepared for this. So one of black's main moves here is to play knight f6, just immediately attacking this e4 pawn and pointing out that the knight can't come to its natural square here to defend it. Now, of course, white could just play something like d3, but this really gives up on all hope of this central expansion white's going for. That was the whole reason they played c3, so they could play d4. So, more often than not, white will just push this pawn to e5, and now after knight d5, it's not too easy to dislodge this knight from the d5 square. Of course, white could play c4 right away, but once again, that would give up all hope of playing d4 in the near future, and the knight would be pretty safe on b6. So white usually goes ahead and executes their plan, plays d4 and grabs the center. But now after c takes d4, this knight's kind of in a nice outpost here on d5, and it can't be harassed by any more pawns. Black usually plays d6, trying to strike back at white's space advantage. You don't want to let white just have a free rein here in the center with pawns for too long. And now both sides, of course, have to get their pieces into the game. So I just pulled a sample line here to show you. Let's say knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, just developing a piece, getting ready to castle, attacking the knight. Pretty natural move. Pawn to e6. Now, it wouldn't make too much sense to take here. You might think you're doubling black's pawns, but you're really not. This pawn's going to be traded off, and really you just gave away a very strong bishop there, and you're giving black the bishop pair. So white's not going to do that more often than not. White can just go ahead and get castled. Let's say bishop e7, black wants to castle as well. Queen e2, reinforcing the pawn, castles, and now knight c3. This is a pretty typical situation in the Alapin, and it's going to be a common theme all throughout several different lines of the Alapin, that white gets a worse pawn structure, but in exchange they have a space advantage, and they have the potential for an attack, especially on the king side. So let's just take a look at this sample game. Knight takes c3, b takes c3, and now d takes c5, d takes c5. So what do we notice? White has these split up pawns here on the queen side. They could potentially be targets. This e5 pawn could potentially be a target. But this e5 pawn could also secure white some space over here to go for an attack on the king. So it's going to be this war between black and white to see whose ideas are going to win out. So for example here, black could play queen a5 and attack both of these pawns. Let's say bishop d2, just defending c3 and getting another piece into the game. Rook d8, rook f to e1, bishop d7, black's finishing up their development. Bishop back to b3, tucking it away. Bishop to e8. Black's trying to regroup over here, connect their rooks. It kind of looks passive here for the bishop to be on e8, but there's not really a better square for it. And it could even help defend some of these kingside attacking ideas, so it does make sense. But now comes queen e4. White's preparing to launch their kingside attack now that all their pieces are getting into the game. Just to quickly show the rest of this example line, I did want to show you this rook d7 idea that I thought was nice. Not only thinking about doubling on the d file, but this queen might even want to come to the d8 square, not only to exert some pressure on the open file, but also to take g5 under control, which could make it harder for white to attack. So let's say rook a to c1, queen back to d8, bishop c2, of course targeting this vulnerable h7 square, g6, white provokes black into playing this move and weakening the dark squares, now comes bishop h6, black brings their final piece into the game targeting this weak c3 pawn, queen f4, white needs more control over the g5 square if they want to play knight g5 because this queen and bishop are both guarding it, knight a5, again thinking about coming to the c4 outpost. Remember, whenever there's an isolated pawn, the square in front of it is an outpost. No pawns can attack a piece on that square, and of course this rook is also revealed to attack the c3 pawn, but now comes knight g5, and of course taking here would really weaken the dark squares. Black would be missing the dark bishop, and they'd be very vulnerable to checkmating attacks on the dark squares, and if they don't take that knight, they have to worry about, of course, guarding all the pawns here as well. Of course, we're far away from the opening phase of the game at this point, but I did want to show you an example line here to show you how both sides can really fight to advance their own, agenda and ideas in this kind of position in the Alapin Sicilian. Coming back to earlier in this line, there's also another type of position we can get within this knight f6, kind of one of the main lines of the Alapin. So let's say white plays e5, knight d5, you already looked at this. This is the main line of this variation. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, these are all very natural moves. White could also take on d6. We didn't look at this in the last kind of example we looked at. Both players kind of maintained this tension for a while, and eventually black was the one who took on e5. White could also take on d6, either now or later, and this leads to a different kind of pawn structure. Of course, this is the typical isolated queen's pawn structure. White has the isolated d-pawn. It doesn't have any buddies here to back it up, but white does have a space advantage for the time being. They have this pawn in the center. As we said, that's a common theme in the Alapin. White has the worst pawn structure, white has the only weakness on the board, but at the same time, this pawn could be a strength for the time being. White has a lot more open lines for the pieces here. The bishops are free, this bishop's hemmed in, and white could still play for some of those attacking ideas. Just to show a sample line here real quick, let's say knight c3, knight back to f6. I kind of liked this idea when I was analyzing this position. It's kind of counterintuitive to move that knight away, but think about it. If you take on c3, you're unisolating this d-pawn. You're letting white take with the b-pawn. And if you allow white to take on d5, now you have to incur an isolated pawn as well, which you could consider doing. I mean, it does kind of open up your bishop, but maybe black doesn't want that. Maybe black wants to play against white's d-pawn. So knight f6 can make sense, and black can consider other ideas to grab further control here of d5. For example, b6 and bishop b7, even knight b4 to d5 is a common kind of theme in some of these isolated queen's pawn positions. So black definitely has some ideas here. Let's say bishop e3, bishop e7, black wants to get castled, of course. a3, very often white plays this sooner or later just to stop this knight b4 idea. Just because if black can successfully castle and play b6, bishop b7, knight b4, black's going to have so much control here of d5. They're just going to blockade that outpost, try to trade off some pieces, and then maybe triple on the d-file in the endgame, putting tons of pressure against this pawn. So white wants to avoid that. White wants to keep pieces on the board and use their extra space to attack. So let's say castle, castle, b6, queen e2, bishop b7. White's bringing that rook to eye the queen, knight a5, and it's a very typical isolated queen's pawn position. White could play for moves like knight e5. White could try to organize, on this diagonal to attack. Of course, black's hoping to neutralize the attack and generate pressure on this pawn in the endgame. Coming back here to our starting position, we've seen why knight f6 is a popular response to the Alapin. One of black's other main replies that really tries to exploit the downside of this c3 move is pawn to d5. And in many openings, you can't really react like this because white's just going to take and quickly play knight c3 with a free tempo on the queen. Of course, the Scandinavian defense is kind of based around that, but if black's already played a move like c5, it can be dangerous to go for this. But of course here, the knight can't come to c3. So if white takes on d5, this queen could be pretty comfortable on d5 for the time being. And of course, if white doesn't take on d5, now black has their fair share of space there in the center. So white usually takes on d5, queen takes d5, and once again, white usually plays d4. That was the whole purpose of playing this move c3. And black could take, and we'd once again get an isolated queen's pawn position. But if they take too early, now this knight has access to c3 again, and this queen's going to have to move again. And white could get a big lead in development here to get their attack going to compensate them for the isolated d-pawn. So that's not usually what black has in mind. Usually they don't take on d4 so early because they want to deprive this knight of the c3 square. So knight f6 is more common, just going ahead with black's development. Knight f3, and black kind of has a choice here. Sometimes they do develop this bishop outside the pawn chain. Sometimes they just lock it in with e6. So let's go ahead and look at e6 first. One very nice idea to know in this particular line of the Alapin, if you're playing it with white, is to play knight to a3. If they're not going to let your knight come to c3, you can put it on a3. And there's kind of a nice point here. You might be threatening to play knight b5, which you're going to play with tempo, by the way, because you're threatening the knight c7 fork, and then you can follow up with bishop f4 and all that kind of stuff to target these dark squares. And if black stops knight b5 with a6, then knight c4 becomes a lot stronger because now the b6 square is weakened. Now you're threatening knight b6. So one line continues like this. Black can play knight d7, of course, to take b6 under control. And there's several ways white could play here. One that I thought was interesting was playing pawn to a4, just making sure this knight gets to stay on c4. You're just stopping black from kicking your knight away. And now if black takes on d4, you don't even have to take with the pawn and get this isolated d-pawn. You could even just take with the queen. Maybe even thinking about taking back with the knight if black exchanges queens. And now there's no isolated pawn. You're just kind of playing this positional game, hoping to have the advantage because of your nice centralized knights here, and also because black still has this problem to solve with a potentially bad light-squared bishop that's kind of hemmed in, whereas both of your bishops are pretty unrestrained. So that's one interesting approach. We could also take a look at a sample line here to see what happens if black does free this bishop. So let's say e takes d5, queen takes d5, d4, knight f6, knight f3. Let's say black does here play bishop to g4. You might think it makes more sense to get this bishop involved instead of locking it in on c8. And you might be right, but white can try to use this to their advantage as well. White might just play bishop e2 and potentially h3, trying to either secure the bishop pair or chase this bishop away. So let's see how this can go. Let's say pawn to e6, opening the line for this bishop, pawn to h3. Now it wouldn't make too much sense to take here, because now white has the bishop pair for no reason, and this bishop's just a monster, right? B7's already a target. So, okay, bishop h5, but now the danger is this bishop's kind of far away from the king side, and black's still a couple moves from getting castled, so you have to watch out for potential threats, to the king here on the white squares, depending on how the game unfolds. White could go ahead and get castled, and if black plays knight c6, now bishop e3 could be a nice idea, and once this bishop comes to e3, black has to be careful here if there's still delaying playing the c takes d4 move, because white might really be threatening to play d takes c5. It's not going to be so easy for black to get that pawn back. For example, I saw one game here that continued rook to d8. Black's just trying to intensify the pressure here to the d4 pawn, hoping to isolate it eventually, but here d takes c5 was pretty strong. Because, again, it's not so easy for black to get their material back. See if you can find the tactical point of what happens if black tries to play bishop takes c5. You can go ahead and pause the video if you want. Okay, if you're back with me. So on bishop takes c5, white can go ahead and take on d5. Black has to take with the rook, of course, to defend this bishop. And now comes pawn to c4. And it's hard for black to defend all their pieces. For example here, if black plays rook f5, trying to stay in touch with this loose bishop, then comes pawn to g4, exploiting this bishop on h5, and white has a very good position. Instead, this particular game continued with d takes c5, queen takes d1, rook takes d1, rook takes, and bishop takes, but again, now white's up a pawn, and white can just play b4 to defend this pawn. For example, knight d5, b4, and even though black could claim to have some compensation here because the pawns are doubled and, they could take this bishop if they want to, white's up a pawn, and especially in an endgame, that can be pretty valuable. So if black delays playing c takes d4 for too long, the moral is look for an opportunity to play d takes c5 if you get the chance. Alright, we've taken a look at a lot of sample lines here. Just one more note to know about the Alapin Sicilian, and that is if black wants to, they can transition into a French defense here, and there's not really a good way to stop them. We've seen that knight f6 and d5 are both main moves here. Black could also play e6, with the idea that after d4, they can just play d5. And now we're just in a French defense, just like if the game began with e4, e6, d4, d5. Also, white has lost the ability to play the knight c3 main line against the French. So if you play knight c3 on move 3 against the French, but you play the Alapin Sicilian, you have to kind of work out what you want to do here in the broader context of your opening repertoire, because black can force you into some French defense lines that you might not know by playing this move order. Usually here, white will just play e5, and now we're just in the main line of the advanced variation of the French defense. And if you want more info on that, I'll also put a link down in the description to my video on the French defense. Alright, thanks for watching everyone. Please make sure you visit chesspathways.com and get signed up. It's totally free, only takes 5 seconds. I'll put a link down in the description to it. And if you sign up, I'm going to send you a free move-by-move guide to chess thinking. It took me way too long to become a chess master, and I want to help you do it in a fraction of the time. Thanks, and I'll see you there.